I never imagined my life would take such a drastic turn. A newly married 25-year-old found myself living what I thought was a fairy tale. My husband, Jack, was everything I had ever dreamed of: attentive, caring, and hardworking. We had met in college and, after 3 years of dating, decided to take the big step. Our wedding was beautiful, intimate, surrounded by close family and friends. Among them was Robert, Jack's father. Robert had always seemed like an interesting man to me. At 55, he maintained an air of youth and vitality that many would envy. His warm smile and deep eyes conveyed a wisdom that only years can bestow. From the beginning, he treated me like a daughter, and I felt grateful to have such an understanding and kind father-in-law. The first months of marriage were like a dream. Jack and I moved into a beautiful house on the outskirts of Boston, a wedding gift from Robert. Everything seemed perfect until one day an incident changed the course of our lives forever. It was a hot summer afternoon. Jack had left early for work, and I was about to take a refreshing shower before starting my daily tasks. The cold water was falling on my skin, relieving the stifling heat, when suddenly I heard the bathroom door open. My heart skipped a beat, thinking Jack had returned early, but the voice I heard wasn't my husband's. "Oh, I'm so sorry," exclaimed Robert, clearly surprised. "I thought no one was home." Panic took over me. Instinctively, I covered my body with my hands, although the shower curtain partially concealed me. "Robert, what are you doing here?" I managed to stammer. "I came to drop off some documents for Jack," he explained, his voice sounding strangely tense. "The door was open, and I'm sorry. I should have called." There was an awkward moment of silence. I could feel his presence on the other side of the curtain, and for some reason, my body reacted in a way that embarrassed me. A shiver ran down my spine, and it wasn't from the cold water. I'm leaving now," Robert finally said. "Excuse me again." I heard his steps moving away and the door closing. I stood there, motionless, with my heart beating 1,000 times a minute. What had just happened? Why did I feel this way? I turned off the faucet and got out of the shower, wrapping my trembling body in a towel. When I finally dared to leave the bathroom, Robert was gone. On the kitchen table, I found the documents he had mentioned, along with a note that said, "I'm very sorry for the misunderstanding. It won't happen again. Robert." That night, when Jack returned from work, I couldn't tell him what had happened. Something inside me prevented me from doing so. I felt guilty, as if I had done something wrong, even though I knew it had all been an accident. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The following days were a whirlwind of confusing emotions. Every time I thought about Robert, my heart raced. I caught myself remembering details of his face, the sound of his voice, the way his eyes looked at me. I tried to convince myself it was just the shock of the incident, but deep down I knew it was something more. A week after the incident, Robert came to dinner Jack had invited him, not knowing what had occurred. Throughout dinner, I could feel Robert's gaze on me. Our eyes met furtively, and every time that happened, I felt an electric current run through my body. After dinner, while Jack was washing the dishes, Robert asked to speak with me privately. We headed to the bow garden, where the night breeze made the tree leaves dance. "I wanted to apologize again for the other day," Robert began, his voice soft and deep. "I can't stop thinking about it." "It's okay," I replied, feeling my cheeks blush. "It was an accident." Robert took a step towards me, shortening the distance between us. I could smell his cologne, a mixture of wood and spices that intoxicated me. "You know," he said in a low voice, "I haven't been able to get you out of my mind since then." His confession left me breathless. Part of me wanted to run away, return to the safety of the house and Jack's arms. But another part, one I didn't know existed, wanted to stay there, lose myself in those eyes that looked at me with desire. "Robert, I began to say, but the words choked in my throat. He raised a hand, gently caressing my cheek. His touch was electric, sending waves of heat throughout my body. "I know it's wrong," he whispered, "but I can't help what I feel." At that moment, We heard Jack's voice calling us from inside. The house Robert quickly moved away, and I stood there trembling, divided between desire and guilt. That night, as I lay in bed next to Jack, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying what had happened in the garden over and over. What was happening to me? I loved Jack, of that I was sure. So why couldn't I stop thinking about his father? Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Robert and I began to see each other in secret, at first, under the guise of family projects or help with household chores. Each encounter was a mixture of excitement and guilt. I knew what we were doing was wrong, but I couldn't stop myself. Our meetings became more frequent and riskier. We would meet in cafes far from the city, in secluded parks, even in his office when we knew no one else would be there. Every time we were together, the outside world seemed to fade away. Robert was everything Jack wasn't. Passionate, impulsive, full of fascinating stories about his travels and experiences. He made me feel alive, desired, as if I were the only woman in the world. But at the same time, guilt was eating me up inside. Jack began to notice changes in my behavior. I became distant, avoiding his caresses and his questions about how I felt. I made up excuses to go out alone, saying I needed time for myself or that I had commitments with friends. I hated lying to him, but the truth was too painful to face. One day, Robert proposed something that would change everything. "Let's leave together," he told me while we were in a motel on the outskirts of the city. "Let's leave everything behind and start a new life." His proposal left me breathless. Part of me wanted to scream, yes, abandon everything and run away with him. But another part, the part that still loved Jack, resisted. "I can't do that to Jack," I replied with tears in my eyes. "He doesn't deserve it." Robert looked at me with a mixture of disappointment and determination. "He will never understand you like I do," he insisted. "He can never give you what I give you." His words pierced my heart like daggers. Was he right? Was Jack incapable of fully satisfying me? Doubt was sown in my mind, growing day by day. Meanwhile, Jack was becoming increasingly suspicious. My excuses no longer seemed to convince him, and I could see the worry and pain in his eyes every time I lied to him. One night, after I returned late from a meeting with Robert, Jack confronted me. "Where were you really?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "I already told you I was with Sarah," I lied, avoiding his gaze. "I called Sarah," Jack said, and I felt my heart stop. "She says she hasn't seen you in weeks." I remained silent, unable to find another lie to tell. Jack approached me, taking my hands in his. "Please," he begged, "tell me the truth. Is there someone else?" Tears began to fall down my cheeks. I wanted to confess everything, to release the weight of guilt that was crushing me, but fear paralyzed me. How could I tell him that I had fallen in love with his own father? "No," I lied again, hating myself for every word. "There's no one else. I'm just going through a difficult time." Jack hugged me, and I felt my heart break a little more. "We're in this together," he told me. "We'll get through whatever is happening." That night, as Jack slept beside me, I made a decision. I had to end things with Robert. I couldn't continue living this double life, destroying the people I loved. The next day, I met with Robert at our usual place, a small cafe in downtown Boston. When I told him I wanted to end our relationship, his face changed. The warmth and love I always saw in his eyes were replaced by something darker, something that scared me. "You can't end things with me," he said, his voice cold and controlled. "Have you forgotten everything we've shared?" "Robert, please," I begged. "This can't continue. We're destroying Jack, our family." He leaned forward, his gaze intense and threatening. "If you try to leave me, I'll tell Jack everything," he threatened. "I'll tell him how his sweet wife has been rolling around with his own father for months." Fear paralyzed me. Robert, the man I thought I loved, was now blackmailing me. How had it come to this? At what point had love turned into this nightmare? "You wouldn't," I whispered, Although deep down I knew he would try me, he replied with a cold smile. You're mine now, and that's how it will be until I decide otherwise. I left that cafe feeling dirty, used, and more alone than ever. I realized that Robert had never really loved me. It had just been a game for him, a way to exert power over me and his own son. The following days were hell. I lived with the constant fear that Robert would fulfill his threat. Every time the phone rang, every time someone knocked on the door, I felt my heart stop. Jack noticed my anxiety, but I kept lying, saying it was stress from work. One night, as we were having dinner in silence, the doorbell rang. Jack went to answer, and I heard Robert's voice. My blood froze. Had he come to confess everything? He entered the living room, greeting me as if nothing had happened between us. His performance was impeccable, the perfect father and father-in-law. But I could see the malicious glint in his eyes, the silent threat in each of his smiles. I've come to talk about something important, Robert announced, sitting on the sofa. My heart was beating so hard I feared the others could hear it. What's it about, Dad? Jack asked, sitting next to me and taking my hand. The gesture, which would have comforted me before, now only, increased my guilt. Robert looked at both of us, and for a moment I thought he would confess everything. But then he smiled, a smile that didn't reach. His eyes. I want you to move in with me, he said. My house is big and I feel lonely. Besides, it could help you save money. The proposal left me, breathless, living under the same roof as Robert would be constant torture. But before I could protest, Jack spoke. That's a great idea, Dad, he said enthusiastically. What do you think, honey? All eyes were on me, Jack's, full of hope and love, Robert's. Threatening and possessive I felt, trapped, with no way out. I need to think about it, I managed to say. It's an important decision. Jack seemed disappointed but nodded. Understandingly, Robert, on the other hand, gave me a look that clearly said I had no choice. That night, after Robert left, Jack and I had a long conversation about the proposal. He was excited about the idea, talking about how we could save money and spend more time as a family. Each of his words was like a dagger in my heart. Are you sure you want to do this? I asked, desperately seeking a way out. Of course, Jack replied, kissing my forehead. It will be good for us. Besides, my dad has always been like a second father to you, hasn't he? His innocent words made me feel nauseous. If only he knew the truth. The following days were a whirlwind of preparations. Jack was enthusiastic about the move, making plans and organizing. Everything I, on the other hand, felt like I was walking towards my own execution. I tried several times to talk to Robert, begging him to reconsider his proposal, but he remained firm. It's the only way to keep you close, he told me in one of our secret encounters. If you try anything, you'll lose everything. Moving day came too soon. As we packed our things, every object I put in the boxes seemed like a reminder of the life I was leaving behind, of the innocence I had lost. Robert's house was huge, an old mansion with spacious rooms and a lush garden. Under other circumstances, I would have marveled at its beauty, but now I only saw a golden prison. The first days were a nightmare. Robert took every opportunity to touch me, accidentally when Jack wasn't looking, to whisper threats disguised as fatherly affection. I felt constantly watched, unable to relax even in my own room. Jack, oblivious to everything, seemed happier than ever. He spent time with his father, sharing anecdotes and laughs during dinners. Seeing them together tore me apart inside. How could Robert betray his own son like this? One night while Jack was working late, Robert entered my room without warning. Panic took over me as I saw him close the door behind him. What are you doing here? I whispered, terrified. I came to claim what's mine, he replied, approaching me with a predatory look. I tried to back away, but the wall prevented me. Please, Robert, don't do this, I begged. He stopped inches from me, his warm breath on my face. Don't you desire me anymore? He asked, his voice a mixture of pain and threat. At that moment, something inside me broke. All the fear, guilt, and anger I had been repressing exploded. No! I shouted, pushing him with all my strength. "This is over. I don't care if you tell Jack everything. I can't keep living like this." Robert seemed surprised by my outburst. For a moment, I saw a flash of vulnerability in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by anger. "You'll regret this," he growled before leaving the room, slamming the door behind him. That night, I couldn't sleep. I knew I had crossed a line, that there was no turning back. When Jack returned from work, I found him in the kitchen, drinking a cup of coffee with a worried expression. "What's wrong?" I asked, fearing the worst. Jack looked at me, his eyes full of a mixture of pain and confusion. "My father just told me something I can't believe." My heart stopped. This was the moment I had feared so much. Closed my eyes, preparing for the final blow. "He says you've been flirting with him," Jack continued, his voice breaking, "that you've been seducing him since we moved here." I opened my eyes suddenly, surprised. What? Had Robert twisted the whole story? "Jack, that's not," I began, but he interrupted me. "I don't know what to believe," he said, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "My father would never lie to me, but you, I can't imagine you doing something like that." At that moment, I realized this was my opportunity. I could keep lying, deny everything and blame Robert. But I was tired of the lies, of living in fear. "Jack," I said, taking his hand, "there's something I need to tell you, the whole truth." And so, with my heart in my hand and tears in my eyes, I told him everything. From the incident in the shower to Robert's threats, through our affair and my regret. Jack listened in silence, his face going through a range of emotions: shock, pain, anger, confusion. When I finished, there was a long silence. I expected him to yell at me, to throw me out of the house, to hate me. But instead, he hugged me. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he asked, his voice broken by crying. "I was afraid," I replied, sobbing against his chest. "Afraid of losing you, of what Robert might do." Jack separated from me, taking my face in his hands. "I love you," he said. "And although this hurts me more than I can express, I understand that you were manipulated. My father, I never thought he would be capable of something like this." At that moment, we heard footsteps on the stairs. Robert appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face a mask of false concern. "Is everything okay?" he asked, looking at both of us. Jack slowly stood up, facing his father. "How could you?" he asked, his voice trembling with contained rage. Robert paled, realizing his plan had failed. "Son, I don't know what you're talking about." He tried to defend himself, but Jack interrupted him. "I know everything, Dad. Every dirty detail of what you did to my wife." What followed was an intense and painful confrontation. Robert tried to deny everything at first, then tried to blame me, saying I had seduced him. But Jack didn't believe him. "I want you to leave," Jack finally said. "This is your house, I know, but I can't bear to see you right now. Go away for a while, until we decide what to do." Robert looked at both of us, defeated. Without saying another word, he went up to his room, packed some things, and left. The silence he left behind was deafening. Jack and I were left alone in the kitchen, emotionally and physically exhausted. We knew we had a long road ahead. Trust was broken. There were deep wounds to heal. "What will we do now?" I asked, fearful of the future. Jack took my hand, intertwining our fingers. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we'll face it together if you're willing to try. So am I." I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and fear. I knew it wouldn't be easy, that there would be difficult times ahead. But for the first time in months, I felt hope. The days and weeks that followed were a process of healing and rediscovery. Jack and I began couples therapy, facing together the demons that my affair with Robert had unleashed. There were moments of pain, anger, and doubt, but there were also moments of forgiveness, understanding, and renewed love. Robert tried to contact us several times, but we decided to keep our distance. We needed time to heal, to rebuild our relationship without his shadow over us. Little by little, we began to rebuild our life. We sold Robert's house and moved to a small apartment in another city, seeking a new beginning. It was difficult at first, leaving behind everything familiar, but it was also liberating. Over time, I learned to forgive myself. I understood that, although I had made mistakes, I had also been a victim of manipulation. Jack, with a patience and love that never ceased to amaze me, supported me every step of the way. Our relationship changed, matured. We were no longer the naive and carefree couple that had married years ago. Now, we were two people who had faced a storm together and had come out the other side, stronger and more united than ever. A year after the incident, while we were having dinner on our small balcony, Jack surprised me with a question. "Would you marry me again?" he asked, holding a simple but beautiful ring. Tears sprang from my eyes as I nodded. "Yes," I replied, 1,000 times yes. We got married in an intimate ceremony, surrounded only by our closest friends. This time, there were no big parties or extravagant gifts. Just the two of us, promising to love and respect each other, aware of how fragile and precious love is. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I think about everything we went through, about how a moment of weakness almost destroyed everything I loved. But I also think about how that experience, as painful as it was, made us stronger. Robert remains a shadow in our past, a reminder of how close we were to losing everything. But he no longer has power over us. We have forgiven, although we will never forget now. As I write these words, I look at Jack sleeping beside me and feel immense gratitude for his love, for his forgiveness, for the second chance we gave ourselves. Our story isn't perfect. It's full of scars and dark moments, but it's our story, and I'm grateful for every chapter, even the most painful ones. Because in the end, I learned that true love isn't a fairy tale without obstacles. It's the willingness to face storms together, to forgive, to grow, and to choose each other every day despite everything. And so, with a heart full of love and hope, I close this chapter of my life, ready to write many more alongside the man I chose and who chose me despite everything.